The Mongol army stretched across the horizon like a white sea, each tent perfectly positioned according to ancient military tradition. As morning light crested the eastern hills, the Great Khan's commanders emerged from their pavilions, already discussing the day's plans. The empire's momentum had carried them this far, but unbeknownst to the rank and file, doubt was beginning to creep into the highest councils. General Beta's hand shook as he examined the latest reports from the western frontiers. The distance from Mongolia, the unfamiliar terrain, the strange customs of these European peoples all weighed heavily upon his mind. He had led successful campaigns before, but something about this campaign felt different. The easy victories of earlier seasons now seemed like distant memories. The messenger's voice carried news that made Beta's blood run cold. Reports of strange alliances forming among the European princes, whispers of new military technologies, and troubling accounts of local populations uniting against the Mongol advance. For the first time in his career, the general felt the familiar certainty of Mongol superiority begin to waver. Bata stared at the map of Europe spread before him, the familiar routes of conquest now appearing as dangerous paths into unknown territory. Each potential campaign route seemed fraught with new challenges. The momentum that had carried Mongol armies across Asia now felt like a burden, stretching supply lines too thin, spreading forces too wide across unfamiliar lands. As Bata walked among his warriors, he witnessed the same confident energy that had conquered half the known world. Yet their enthusiasm only deepened his anxiety. These men expected victories like those in Persia and China, but Europe presented challenges unlike anything the Mongols had faced. The weight of their expectations pressed down upon his shoulders like physical chains. The War Council convened as the sun reached its zenith, bringing together the empire's finest military minds. Arguments erupted over strategy, with some advocating swift strikes against key European cities while others urged caution. Bata listened to each perspective, but the voices of doubt grew louder within him. The easy path forward no longer seemed clear. Standing alone on the hill, Bata gazed down at the encampment that represented the pinnacle of Mongol military achievement. Thousands of warriors, countless horses, supplies enough for months of campaigning, all waiting for his command. Yet the man who had led them to victory after victory now felt paralyzed by choices that could determine the fate of the empire itself. As evening approached, Bata found himself drafting letters to the Great Khan, attempting to explain his concerns about the European campaign. Each word felt heavier than the last. How could he, one of the empire's most successful generals, express doubts about continuing the conquest that had brought such glory to Mongol arms? The very act felt like betrayal. The map told a story of unprecedented success, Mongol banners marking victories from the Pacific to the heart of Europe. Each conquered territory represented months of campaigning, countless battles won, and enemies crushed beneath the hooves of Mongol cavalry. Yet now those same markers of triumph appeared as warnings of overextension, each success making the next challenge more difficult. Sleep eluded Batu as the night deepened, his mind racing through scenarios of potential campaigns and their consequences. The empire expected continued expansion, the Great Khan demanded results, and his warriors hungered for glory. Yet something deep within his experience as a military leader screamed warnings that he struggled to articulate, even to himself. Below the general's window, his warriors gathered around fires, their voices carrying tales of past victories and dreams of future conquests. Their certainty mocked his own doubts, their enthusiasm highlighting his growing hesitation. These men had never known defeat, never questioned Mongol superiority. How could he burden them with his fears? Beta's fingers traced the familiar engravings on his ceremonial sword, each mark telling stories of ancestors who had carved the empire from wilderness and war. This blade had witnessed triumphs that seemed impossible now, when the same weapon felt heavy with unspoken doubts. The weight of Mongol tradition pressed against his palm like a physical force. The letter to the Great Khan remained unfinished, crossed-out lines and crumpled drafts littering his desk. How could he explain that the momentum that had carried Mongol armies across continents now felt like a force beyond his control? That the very success of previous campaigns had created problems that no amount of courage could solve? Each attempt to write the words felt like admitting failure. Dawn brought no clarity to Beta's troubled mind, only the familiar routine of another day's decisions. The encampment stirred to life around him, warriors preparing for orders they expected to be swift and decisive. Yet the general who emerged from his tent wore the weight of sleepless hours, his usual confident stride replaced by hesitant steps that spoke of internal struggle. The morning council erupted into chaos as commanders voiced conflicting opinions about the European campaign's continuation. Some argued for immediate strikes against vulnerable targets, others urged consolidation of conquered territories. Bata listened to each argument, but the voices of caution that had haunted his sleep now seemed to grow louder than the calls for glory. Among his warriors, Bata witnessed the same martial excellence that had brought the Mongols to the pinnacle of military achievement. Their skill with bow and blade remained unmatched, their horsemanship legendary. Yet the perfection of their training only deepened his anxiety about leading them into challenges that no amount of individual prowess could overcome. The captured European weapons seemed crude beside Mongol craftsmanship, yet their very existence spoke of cultures that had survived centuries of conflict. Bata studied each piece, wondering if their apparent simplicity masked strategies and tactics that his army had never encountered. The trophies of victory now appeared as warnings about the complexity of the challenges ahead. From the hilltop, the encampment appeared as a perfect expression of Mongol military discipline, each element positioned according to ancient tradition. The sight should have filled Batu with pride, but instead it reminded him of the enormous responsibility resting on his shoulders. Every tent, every warrior, every horse represented lives that would be risked on his decisions. The intelligence reports painted a picture that contradicted Beta's expectations of easy conquest. European princes were forming unprecedented alliances, local populations were uniting against Mongol rule, and unfamiliar military technologies were appearing on battlefields. Each piece of information chipped away at the certainty that had guided Mongol expansion for generations. Every route on the map now appeared fraught with potential disasters waiting to unfold. Rivers that seemed fordable might become impassable, forests that offered cover could conceal ambushes, and cities that appeared vulnerable might prove impregnable. The tactical genius that had served Mongol armies so well in Asia now struggled to find clear paths through European complexity. The War Council's arguments grew more heated as commanders debated the wisdom of continuing the European campaign. Voices rose as experienced warriors clashed over strategy, each presenting compelling reasons for their preferred course of action. Bata listened to each perspective, but the cacophony of opinions only deepened his sense of isolation and responsibility. As the sun set over the encampment, Bata found himself once again alone with his thoughts. The peaceful beauty of the evening sky mocked his inner turmoil, the same sky that had witnessed Mongol victories across 3 continents. Tomorrow would bring new decisions, new risks, and new opportunities for either glory or disaster. The unfinished letter to the Great Khan lay before him, each draft revealing more clearly the doubts that plagued his mind. How could he explain that the momentum of conquest now felt like a force that might destroy everything it had built? That the very success of Mongol arms had created challenges beyond the reach of traditional military solutions? In the privacy of his quarters, surrounded by the objects that represented his career of service to the empire, Bata searched for answers that seemed increasingly elusive. Each trophy, each weapon, each piece of armor told stories of Mongol superiority that now felt like distant echoes. The familiar comfort of his personal space offered no relief from the weight of command. Another dawn brought renewed expectations from his warriors, their faces bright with anticipation of orders that would send them into battle. Bata moved among them with the practiced ease of decades of command, yet each step felt heavier than before. The enthusiasm surrounding him only emphasized his growing uncertainty about the path ahead. The latest intelligence reports had confirmed Beta's worst fears about the European situation. Enemy alliances were strengthening, local resistance was growing more organized, and supply lines were stretching beyond sustainable limits. Each new piece of information made the continuation of the campaign seem more precarious, yet withdrawal would represent an unprecedented admission of limitation. The jade seal bore the mark of imperial authority, each carving representing generations of Mongol rulers who had expanded their dominion across the known world. Now this symbol of power felt like a burden too heavy to bear, the weight of countless lives and the empire's future resting on decisions that no amount of military experience could make easy. The gathering storm seemed to echo Beta's inner turmoil as he contemplated the decisions that would determine the campaign's fate. Thunder rolled across the sky like the voices of ancestors questioning his hesitation, while lightning illuminated the encampment below in stark relief. Nature itself appeared to sense the momentous choice approaching. The blank parchment before him represented a choice between two paths that both led to uncertainty. One route promised continued expansion but carried risks that his experience warned against, while the other offered safety but threatened the Mongol tradition of never knowing retreat. Each moment of hesitation felt like a betrayal of the warriors who trusted his leadership. The encampment's evening routine proceeded with the same precision that had brought Mongol armies to victory after victory, yet Bata watched the familiar scene with new eyes. Each organized movement, each disciplined formation, each efficient preparation now appeared as elements of a machine that demanded constant expansion or faced the risk of stagnation. The captured European documents revealed military concepts that challenged Mongol assumptions about warfare. Defensive strategies, siege techniques, and coordinated resistance movements appeared in the foreign script like warnings from an unknown enemy. Bata realized that the momentum of conquest might be colliding with limitations that no amount of courage could overcome. The War Council's discussions had evolved from tactical debates into fundamental questions about the nature of Mongol expansion itself. Experienced commanders voiced concerns about overextension, supply line vulnerabilities, and the unprecedented unity of European resistance. Each argument carried implications that reached far beyond the current campaign. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the camp lay still and the future remained unwritten, Bata walked among his sleeping warriors. Each tent housed men who trusted his leadership implicitly, whose lives would be risked on decisions made in these dark hours. The weight of that trust felt heavier than the armor he had worn into countless battles. The words flowed slowly from his pen, each sentence carrying implications that would echo through Mongol history. He wrote of tactical considerations and strategic necessities, of supply line limitations and enemy coordination, of factors that made continued expansion increasingly dangerous. Yet beneath the military language lay an admission that the Mongol momentum had finally met its match. The letter bore the Great Khan's seal and carried Beta's recommendation to consolidate conquered territories rather than pursue further expansion into Europe. Each word represented a turning point in Mongol history, a moment when the empire's relentless momentum would finally pause before the complexity of challenges that no amount of military prowess could solve. Dawn brought clarity to Beta's mind but uncertainty to his heart. The decision was made, the letter dispatched to the Great Khan, and the momentum of Mongol expansion finally checked by the reality of European resistance. As his warriors awakened to begin another day, their general faced the challenge of explaining choices that would reshape the empire's destiny. From the hilltop, the encampment appeared unchanged from countless dawns that had preceded victories across 3 continents. Yet today marked a fundamental shift in Mongol strategy, the moment when expansion gave way to consolidation, when momentum yielded to prudence. The empire that had never known limits now faced the wisdom of restraint. Among his warriors, Bata carried the burden of choices that would determine whether the Mongol Empire continued its unprecedented expansion or consolidated its existing conquests. Their respectful attention reminded him that leadership required not just military skill but the wisdom to recognize when even the mightiest armies must pause before challenges too great to overcome. The map revealed the true scope of Mongol achievement and the unprecedented challenge of maintaining control across such enormous distances. Supply lines stretched like threads connecting Europe to Asia, vulnerable to disruption and increasingly difficult to sustain. The momentum that had carried armies to victory now threatened to unravel the very fabric of imperial control. The Great Khan's response arrived with all the ceremony of imperial authority, bearing news that would determine the fate of Mongol expansion into Europe. Some commanders showed relief at the decision to consolidate rather than risk further campaigns, while others displayed disappointment at the end of seemingly endless opportunities for glory and conquest. As his warriors gathered around fires to share the day's experiences and dreams of future victories, Bata stood apart, carrying the weight of decisions that would reshape Mongol destiny. Their camaraderie and shared purpose reminded him that leadership sometimes required choosing the difficult path of restraint over the easy route of continued expansion. The correspondence carried news that would ripple across the Mongol Empire, informing commanders in distant territories that the era of unlimited expansion had given way to strategic consolidation. Each document represented a fundamental shift in imperial policy, a recognition that even the greatest armies must sometimes choose prudence over ambition. Another dawn brought new routines to the encampment as warriors adapted to orders that emphasized consolidation over expansion. Bata moved among them with renewed purpose, understanding that leadership sometimes required the courage to halt momentum before it carried everything to ruin. The empire would endure, but its growth had finally met natural limits. From the hilltop, Bata witnessed the transformation of his army from an instrument of endless expansion into a force for imperial stability. The same discipline that had conquered Europe now served to secure Mongol achievements against the challenges that had finally checked their momentum. The empire would endure, shaped by the wisdom of knowing when to stop.